Hi there, everyone. Welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. My name is Ellie Colt, and I'm an Alumni Engagement Officer at York University. Thank you so much for joining us for today's topic, Art Venues Hold the Key to an Innovative Society. As this event is virtual and we are not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that the following land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you're currently on. If this is the case, please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. The website native-land.ca is a great resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognise that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon, One Bell Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now, before we get started today, I just wanted to share some exciting York news with all of you. Many of you may have heard of the Bryden Alumni Awards, which have been an annual awards reception for over 20 years. Last year in 2020, we paused the ceremony to reflect on 20 years of incredible success and tradition established by the awards. This year, we are pleased to present the reimagined 2021 York U Alumni Awards. We'll be celebrating with a virtual awards show on November 18th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Along with the 4 incredible alumni award recipients that we will be honoring, we also have an amazing lineup of talent joining us, including 4-time Juno nominee and current York student Sarah Sleen, and alum Hudo Hershey, who was selected as the new face of Canada at the Just for Laughs Festival in Montreal recently. All of these amazing individuals will join President Linton on the virtual stage, and there'll be an opportunity for networking immediately after the show. We'd like to invite you all to join us, and we promise an entertaining evening celebrating the pride of York's alumni, students and friends like yourselves. Tickets are complimentary and registration is required. To learn more, you can visit our website, which is www.yorku.ca. The link is just in the chat there. Navigate to our events page and you'll find it under York U Alumni Awards. Now, before we begin, we'd like to get to know our audience a bit better with a quick poll before each lecture. Today's question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? So that should pop up on your screen right now, and I'll just give everyone a moment to respond. Great, thank you so much everyone for participating. It's helpful for us and our speakers to just have an idea about who's in our audience and the knowledge that you each have about the topic of discussion, so we really appreciate that. If you need help at all with this Zoom webinar, you can feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Our team is on standby, ready to help you. That same button can also be used to submit questions for our guest speakers to answer during the Q&A period following today's presentation. And for those of you watching live on Facebook, you're welcome to submit any questions or comments through the comment section for the video, and the team will send them my way. Please do note that all your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and our staff working hard behind the scenes. We do ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. Now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce the moderator for today's talk, Kelly Barron. Kelly has completed both an IBBA at Schulich and a BA in English at York University. She's the publisher of the Puritan Literary Magazine and is currently an instructor for the management area at LAPS, where she teaches alongside today's guest speaker, Dr. David Weitzner. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you. Now, it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce the star talent for today's discussion, and that is my good friend and mentor, David Weitzner. It gives me even greater pleasure to share that he's given me permission to improv his introduction. David did his BA in philosophy at Western. He did an MBA and a PhD in strategy and ethics here at York University through the Schulich School of Business, but he is at heart a philosopher who studied with Jacques Derrida and Emil Fackenheim, and once famously got permission from Richard Rorty himself to be a strategist instead of a philosopher. Now, his thinking is deeply indebted to arts industries, and he was once an EMI exec back in the height of the music industry days, and he charmed many of his former students, myself included, with stories of Art Garfunkel making all of the women in the office cry, or Radiohead just wanting some good British tea with the crust cut off, or sandwiches with the crust cut off. And it is that background, so that beautiful intersection between philosophy and music and management studies, that brings us to our topic today, which is that arts venues hold the key to an innovative society. So David, I want to thank you for inviting me to be your moderator. And I also want to thank you for taking the time to be able to share this topic with our listeners. And I want to start our conversation today by talking about wonder. Now, wonder is and has consistently been essential for your thought process. It was a key theme in your first book, 15 Paths Through ECW. It's continued to be a key theme in Connected Capitalism, so your recent book with the New Jewish Press through U of T. And you argue that it's essential to an innovative and spiritual work environment. And I was wondering if you could share that thought process and explain the importance of wonder for everyone today.
Sure. So let me just step back for a second and say, the heart of wonder is being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that introduction made me very uncomfortable. So I want to thank you, Kelly, for taking on the role from student to now teacher and forcing me to sit in my uncomfortableness, which is the heart of wonder. People often don't really get where innovation comes from. They think that innovation and this culture of curiosity and creativity can be plopped into any corporation. Prior to my coming back to academia, I worked as a consultant. And there's this story that I've told to students, but I'll share with the folks here today that really speaks to this point. I worked for a tech startup, and the individual said, he looked at the company and he realized that these folks were very lazy, not particularly creative, and rather exploitive of his generosity. And he said, I'm going to make this company like Google. I want to be as creative as Google. So what is it that Google does that brings the creativity live in their workspace? Well, I've read the books, I've seen the documentaries. It must be the basketball net in the conference room. It must be the beanbag chairs throughout the offices. It must be the free snacks. That must be the key to innovativeness. And so we spent a ton of money bringing all these wonderful things into these offices. And at the end of the day, our culture became even lazier, as now these folks had more distractions to keep them from innovating. The heart of innovation is a sense of wonder. And wonder is born out of being uncomfortable. Wonder happens in the psychology research when our sense-making frame is challenged. When we encounter something new and we say, I don't get it, it doesn't fit, or even better, when we say nothing, right? That silence can be a moment of wonder. And I've always been very interested in how we can bring wonder into the workspace, into the political space, into spaces that require this type of thinking. And my two books really meld on that theme, in that I think we find the ability to develop wonder in spiritual spaces, and more specifically for our purposes today, in art spaces.
So expand on that a little bit. Why art spaces? What can we glean from art spaces? How is it that when I go and spend, say, $150 to go and see Feist last week, be able to perform her new album backstage at the Sony Center, how is it that I'm signing up for an experience of discomfort rather than comfort? How is it that I'm signing myself up for an experience of wonder?
Right. Well, that was actually a beautiful show, and it's actually an excellent example. Yes. When you think of what Feist did, which was quite unique, is she brought the audience on stage with her. And so rather than have the traditional divide between the audience and the artist, the audience surrounded her on the stage. And that was unsettling for some. The cameraman, as you'll recall, moved around through the room, filming people, so that on the screen wasn't her, the artist, wasn't a performer, but other folks who were participants, or so they thought. In Connected Capitalism, in the new book that we're talking about, I had the pleasure of interviewing Ronnie Burkett, who is a local luminary puppeteer. And, I saw in the prior world, in the pre-pandemic world, I had the fortune to see him perform at Luminato. And that event, that show was the stimulus for that part of the book, because I bought a ticket to be an audience member and to watch a master puppeteer perform. And unbeknownst to me and the other 100 folks in attendance, when we walked in, we were handed puppets and we were asked to perform. Ronnie was going to move around and encourage us, but the audience were the performers. And all of us there that night were really uncomfortable, but it worked. And after that night, I thought, I have to find out how he does this. And so I went down to Puppetland, his studio in Toronto, to ask him how he managed it. And he said something which I found really powerful. He said, today, we associate safety with not being challenged. And as an artist, he finds that very problematic. He said, when he performs, he creates a space that is full of love. The audience knows that he loves every single person that bought a ticket, that cares about his art, that cares about creativity. Every person in that room he has love for. And so they should feel safe because he emanates that love. But he said, just because you're safe doesn't mean I'm not going to ask you to do things that make you uncomfortable. Quite the opposite. Because I've made you safe, I'm not shy to make you uncomfortable. And I thought that was so wild, because you couldn't do that in the business space, right? You could not.
No.
I couldn't even do that in the classroom. I couldn't deliberately say, I'm going to make my students uncomfortable because they know I care about them. It wouldn't fly. It wouldn't work. But we give artists this license that allows beautiful things to happen when they take it. And so I thought, there is nothing that Ronnie is doing in his theater space that we can't do in our workspaces. We don't do it in our workspaces, and that's a problem. And so, to tie to the theme of today's conversation, until we start doing this in our workspaces and in our universities, we need to go to art spaces to hone our sense of wonder, because it seems artists are still empowered to make us uncomfortable. Artists are still empowered to challenge our frames. Artists are still empowered to ask us to do things that maybe aren't natural to us. And through that discomfort, through that experience, through immersing ourselves in the ambiguity and the dissonance of the creative moment, maybe at least we can take some of that back with us into the workspace.
Now, if I remember correctly, that section of your book, you end up talking about co-creation and co-creation as being essential to being able to bring in wonder into the workplace environment. Can you tell us a little bit about co-creation and how you see it being connected into the discomfort that's present in wonder?
Absolutely. I've been in management departments for over 20 years, but I've said for a long time now, I'm not really interested in management. Managing suggests the manager, that individual, is in control, and they're controlling resources, they're controlling people, and the creation somehow is stemming from their efforts at exerting power over others. And that's never been interesting to me. And so I say that I'm a management prof who's more interested in co-creation. Co-creation is where we come together to create something that's transformational. And that's really what happens every time I feel I've stepped into an artistic space, whether it's going to a concert, right? You remember because you were part of the discussion, but when we had our launch event for 15 Paths, the last book, in Brooklyn at the now shuttered, unfortunately, Rough Trade,
So
such
sad.
a beautiful space, victim of the pandemic. We had Nels Klein from Wilco there. And if you remember, he talked about that. He said, as an improviser, the audience is as important to creating the art as the people on stage. We're authentically in a co-creative enterprise. The feelings we exude, the support we give, the energy we give, and some of this sounds maybe fluffy to the business mind, and I think that that's a mistake. I think it's quite substantive, because there's something real that's happening. We might not have the right descriptors right now. Maybe we're not using the right metaphors, right? Maybe for a business audience, the language of spirituality or energy doesn't work for them, but something happens in a theater, something happens in an art gallery, something happens in a concert hall that doesn't necessarily happen in a boardroom, That doesn't necessarily happen in a management class. And we need to learn from that, because it is through co-creation that we can transform both ourselves and our environment. And that's what business seeks to do, right? At the end of the day, the goal of business is not to accumulate profits. Profits is a nice bonus towards doing what businesses actually do, which is create value. And they create value through transformation, through creation, through partnerships, through cooperating with a broad range of stakeholders. And if more of us spent time building our sense of wonder, becoming comfortable, being uncomfortable, and emerging stronger, right? Building new relationships through this discomfort, right? As we started today, you've made me uncomfortable. and we'll only become stronger because of that, because that sets the tone and allowed us to do what we're doing right now, which is co-creation. Quite frankly, I'm really grateful you're here today, because the alternative would have been a lecture, which doesn't interest me at all, right? A lecture is not co-creation. It becomes co-creation when we talk together, when we work together. And I do hope in 4 minutes time, when we open the floor to the audience, I hope the folks here today will join us in our co-creative efforts. Bring your questions, bring your thoughts, and let's see what sort of beautiful thing we can construct in this hour that we have today.
Now, it just not really switching gears, but just one other thing that I did want to bring up and I wanted you to speak about before we turn it over to Q&A. And this does, I think, tie in very nicely, because thinking back to that launch that we did in Brooklyn at Rough Trade, I'm actually thinking now about something that Lee Ronaldo had said to us rather than Nels. And Lee was talking about how musical performances were journeys without outcomes, that you were signing up to be able to go on some kind of journey, some kind of experience when you were buying a ticket to be able to go to a concert venue. And you didn't necessarily know what that outcome was going to be. Now, can you speak a little bit about journey, and if you can tie that in a little bit to wonder and co-creation, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I brought that piece of Lee into my classroom in the business world, in the management school, because I think it's such an interesting idea. One of the most dangerous, counterproductive ideas that we teach managers, right? One of the most dangerous management ideas is inefficiency. This idea that if we're not explicitly on track, if I can't in this moment see the connection between the activity my workers are doing right now and the profits I will be making as a result, it's an inefficient use of resources. It's an inefficient use of time. That is a mistake. That kills creativity. That kills innovation. Good companies, and I'm not using this in the moral sense, we'll park that, right? But good companies, in the sense of companies that are successful in meeting their goals, recognize that's a mistake. One example that I talk about a lot in my book is Google, and that's why I've qualified it. I don't know that I call Google a good company morally, but Google are certainly successful. And one of the ways that they're successful is they've recognized that with their engineering team, productivity means 3 days a week. They've recognized that if they want their team to be innovative, half the week they are going to be doing things that don't make sense to their supervisor, that don't make sense to the manager, that don't necessarily contribute in a material, clear, objective way to their project. But they know that that journey is necessary to ultimately take the other journey that will lead to the productive outcome. They know that if you don't sometimes just play and explore your creativity and explore your imagination, and maybe don't get to where you need to be, you'll never get to that place you need to be. And I think that it's inspiring to know that at least in the tech world, there are some companies who've come to recognize this. But many of us still, unfortunately, are managed in our jobs. And many of us, unfortunately, are afraid of being inefficient, which is why, again, I hope those of us in that space take advantage of art venues, use that experience to go on these journeys, to hone your innovative and creative sense, and then again, bring it back to your workspace and maybe elicit some change there and encourage your leadership to move away from an emphasis on efficiency and towards co-creation.
And we've also, just to be able, I'll contextualize this a little bit within recent work from Harvard, but we've seen the high price of efficiency as being something that's been discussed in more, financial, instrumental terms. That high price of efficiency article that was published with HBR, I believe in 2019 from Roger Martin, that was discussing some of the financial implications of focusing on efficiency. And we can recognize that it's detrimental to how society functions as a whole. So Martin's article takes the example of Walmart and looking at Walmart as a company that pays the absolute minimum wage, and then the cost to society for that is, I believe, approximately $2,500 per Walmart employee in terms of taxpayer funds in the US. So it's not just that it ends up being beneficial for the business itself, but we can also see that this aggressive focus in on efficiency is detrimental to societal welfare.
If there's one lesson, and there were many, but if there's one lesson that came out of the pandemic, it's that inefficiency will not be the approach of the future. Industries that didn't build in redundancies suffered massively. The reason we had these crises, the reason there were these shortages, the reason we were struggling in so many ways to get vaccines, to get PPE, really to deal with the crisis, was because prior to the pandemic, there was a move towards efficiency. And efficiency and just-in-time management and these other ideas work when there's no strain on the system. But when there's a strain, especially an unpredictable one, the result is catastrophic. Hopefully, we've learned from the pandemic to build redundancies, to stop privileging inefficiencies. But more importantly, for the talk today, hopefully out of the pandemic, we've realized that we need to re-emphasize human aspect of things, that we need to allow people to feel fully as individuals, as human beings. Hopefully, we've realized that the arts are missed. Hopefully, after being locked at home for 18 months now, right? More of us are saying it's time to get out there and experience creativity in person to support these venues that have been shut down for the better part of a year and a half and allow them to thrive in our post-pandemic world.
And they really do need us right now because, as you said, so you had the lovely article for the conversation. You had pointed out that in the wake of the pandemic, we've seen that some businesses have been winners and losers, and that the winners have been those that have received government funding and received government help, and the losers have unfortunately been our arts venues.
Yeah. So why don't we open the floor now and see if folks want to join our conversation?
Absolutely. Okay, so let's start this out. We've got a question here. So how is the idea of wonder being received in the business world?
Right. So surprisingly, or maybe not, it's being received very well. There is a lot of hunger for something different, for something that recenters our humanness. And we're seeing spiritual language emerging in the business world in a way that it hasn't before. We're seeing a recognition that individuals need to bring and have their whole selves celebrated at work, not just their productive self, not just their efficient self, but their whole selves. And what I find really interesting when I go out and give talks on the topic of wonder in corporate settings is their biggest fear is what happens to power when I allow those beneath me to feel wonder. Their fear is that their leadership will somehow be. So one of the questions I often get is, does this mean all organizations need to be flat? Does this mean hierarchy gets disposed of? And my answer is no. One of the things we know nowadays, you talked about research and leadership. One of the things we know is that leadership shouldn't be viewed anymore as a trait in an individual, but in fact, it's a characteristic of a relationship, right? Those who are being led, as it were, are as important to the success of the leader as any individual characteristic that he or she might contain in of themselves. And so what I often say to the corporate folks is, in this world of wonder, the locus of power remains the same, but the nexus shifts. In other words, yeah, settle down. You're still the CEO. You're still the VP. Don't worry. You still have your title, right? But those relationships that allow you to do your job, that allow your organization to do its job, need to be healthy. And wonder and co-creation allows those relationships to be healthy in a way that a more, I'll say, transactional type of leadership doesn't support, if that makes sense.
Absolutely does. It's interesting to see that power is their major concern and hierarchical structures are still the concern, because I remember you lecturing about a decade ago on changes in corporate structure towards like a more flat organization, and looking towards things that a decade ago you had described as, I believe it was a virtual organization, that you said we didn't yet have an example of it in practice. And of course, today we do. Now, next question for you. Are there other things that the business world can learn from the arts?
So much so. One of the things that people forget sometimes is that artists are also entrepreneurs, most of them. And we don't view them as such. When we think of the entrepreneur, we like to think of the tech bro out in Silicon Valley, right? Or somebody creating a product or a company that will ultimately go public and make a lot of money. And they don't realize that our independent artists are entrepreneurs, and their approach to business is both so radically different than the more corporate approach, and yet equally, if not more so, successful. And the reason I say more so is because you have a breadth of success. Any artist that is making a living, any artist that is getting by being an artist is successful in their entrepreneurial venture, right? Because the goal of their entrepreneurial venture is to support their creativity and the output of their art. And to the extent that they're able to do that, they're successful entrepreneurs. And so speaking to artists, not just about the message of their art, but about the message of how they live, how they run their business, right? Their entrepreneurial spirit is one that we don't spend enough time exploring. I think we spend too much time talking to CEOs who tend to say the same thing or embrace a rather similar type of philosophy, and not enough time learning from artists about their approach to entrepreneurship and their lessons and the things that are important to them. And it's a fascinating topic to discuss. I once had the privilege of having my friend Sunshine Jones of Dub Tribe Sound System give a talk to business students. And he models a type of entrepreneurship that in many ways is super unattractive to them, right? So he talks about his t-shirt venture. As we know right now, many artists make more money off of their merchandise than off of their music. Sunshine Jones is not one of those people, because Sunshine Jones only makes $1 off of every t-shirt he sells. Why? Because Sunshine Jones has decided that he wants to source his products ethically. He wants to pay the workers appropriately. He wants to make sure that every piece of the t-shirt making supply chain meets his high ethical standards. And he realized that in so doing, his costs are around $29. He doesn't have the heart, these are his words, to sell his t-shirt for more than $30. He thinks that would then exploit his audience. So because he doesn't want to exploit his workers, because he doesn't want to exploit the supply chain, because he doesn't want to exploit his audience, he sells his t-shirts for $30. They're very popular. They're beautiful. He only makes $1.
How did your students respond to that?
So I'm saying a business student might look at that and be a little bit turned off. But it's part of a broader picture, because, okay, he's not making the money off the t-shirt, but more people support him in all his ventures. They support his record label. They support his shows. They support him individually, right? And he has, thankfully, been able to make a career as an artist for over 40 years, if I'm not mistaken, right now. So it works. There are different approaches, but not everything needs to be done in the way we teach in business schools. Or rather, what we teach in business schools maybe needs to adapt and learn from folks outside of the traditional corporate setting.
Now, that's changing the business school education and changing the business school environment is something that you have been dedicated to for a long time. If this is now just a question coming directly from me because I would love to hear your thoughts on this. But if you were able to incorporate these qualities of co-creation and wonder and learning from the arts into a business school education, what do you think that would actually look like? So can you
So
imagine a world where you are teaching this ideal course, you've been given the full academic freedom, how are you going to influence these students?
I can answer that question easily because I am not an innovator. My mentor, one of my mentors, Ed Freeman, he is known as the father of stakeholder theory. He is a strategy and ethics professor at the University of Virginia, Darden Business School. And Ed Freeman, and by the way, only Ed Freeman today can get away with this, brought a theater course to his MBA. And as part of the MBA training at Darden, to learn about leadership and co-creation, these business students with no arts background work with Ed and a local theater director. They write a play over the course of the semester. They perform a play at the end of the semester. They get full business school credit for that experience. Can I envision a world where maybe we do something like this? Maybe. Right? One of the privileges of being at Freeman, I imagine, is the ability to bring this, but it works. It's an experiment that he brought to the Darden Business School. It was incredibly successful. It was incredibly well received. It's a beautiful model to know that artistic-based training not only can be valued in a business school, but was valued in an elite business school to great success. It just requires being open to rethinking what leadership training means, what business training means, and what management training means in the contemporary era.
There was also, if I remember correctly from when you and I were doing research on the intersection between humanities and management studies, there was a famous case study of teaching ethics through the Great Gatsby at Harvard. And there was an example of business students in Harvard's MBA program who were all told that they had to go and read The Great Gatsby as part of an ethics course, and then had to submit effective responses to The Great Gatsby as a way to be able to teach ethics.
That's right. And if we can tie back this discussion again to the theme of this afternoon, which is the role of arts venues, it's these partnerships that are critical. So if there are any arts managers who are watching this talk today and are inspired by this, email me, because I would love to partner with an arts venue and find a way to bring our business students into that environment to learn about wonder, to learn about creativity. It's going to happen in the arts venues, I imagine, more likely than in the business settings. And so it's not just that arts venues are important as standalone institutions, but building partnerships to these institutions is of critical importance for non-arts venues to thrive. We want to fully benefit from the wisdom that is contained in these environments. And sometimes that wisdom is shared by buying a ticket and being a member of the audience. But maybe that wisdom can also be shared in more non-traditional ways, like what happened out in Virginia, where a local theater company partnered with the business school to develop this type of course.
Now, your next question is from a musician named Brian Katz. So he's given us a question here in the Q&A saying, I'm a high-risk improvising musician who actually teaches a course here at York called Open Improvisation. We for sure invite wonder in our classes, and we give students many ABC type skill sets to foster a vocabulary of tools that they can use to build their musicianship and personal voice. That is to say, we practice improvisation. I feel that it's important that the world beyond the arts need to realize that there are many specific skill sets that can foster creativity and find through experimentation the ways that creativity will enhance their business and practice them. And he'd like to know your thoughts.
I agree 100%, Brian, and shoot me an email because, I think that improvisers have so much to teach. I learned so much from Lee Ronaldo, Nels Klein, master improvisers about my trade, what I do. In other words, I am not a talented musician, but I've learned from these brilliant improvisers how to better my craft as a writer, how to better my craft as a consultant, how to better my craft as a professor. And I agree 100% that the skill set that is needed to thrive in our post-pandemic world is a varied skill set. And I think that to have the change we want, almost the obligation is on you, Brian, to teach your students, your artistic students, your musician students, to value their skills in multiple settings. So I think they need to know that if they're solid improvisers, yes, that's great on a performance stage. Yes, that's great for a recording. But also, you might have what to say to a strategist. You might have what to say in a business environment. You might have what to say in a policy-making environment to recognize, as we do, right, that their skill set need not be and should not be contained to their particular trade or craft, but is really valued in the broader world. And you know, one of the most unfortunate things I think about management training today is the self-selection, right? A certain type of individual chooses to go to a business school, and a certain type of individual wouldn't be caught dead in a business school. And that's a shame, because we need all sorts of folks. We need to bring the management and business training outside of the business school, as we do here at York. We have business and liberal arts and professional studies as well as in the business school. So that's a good first step. And we have at Schulich the joint MBA with fine arts. So again, bringing fine arts people into the business school, that's a great second step. But we need more than that. We need to have this comfort in this cross-functional discussion to happen everywhere, truly everywhere, because every discipline has what to offer business thinking, and business thinking has what to offer to most disciplines. And I really hope that this trading of skills will happen more frequently. And again, to tie back to our theme, I believe it will happen in these arts venues. So I'm more convinced that this will happen when we see each other at concerts and we chat there than it will happen in a classroom. I'm more optimistic that meeting in arts venues will have this sort of cross collaboration, cross pollination than in the more stuffy environment of a registered program.
Now, a nice follow-up question to that. So could you suggest some practical tips of being uncomfortable in our workspaces and making it more meaningful? And do you have any recommendations on shows, venues, or art galleries that you recommend that the audience should visit to spark wonder?
Yeah, well, check out Ronnie Burkett. He's a local genius, and I'm sure he'll be up and running, performing as soon as post-COVID restrictions allow him to do so. But I think the experience can happen in any arts venue. I think it can happen going to the ballet. I think it can happen going to the opera. I think it can happen at the AGO, and I think it can happen at smaller gallery spaces as well. I think the notion is go somewhere where you're not comfortable. So I would argue, if you are someone whose preference is classical music and you're most comfortable in the ballet, go to a punk show. And similarly, if you're most comfortable in the punk rock club, put on a jacket, go to the opera, right? Go to an artistic space that makes you uncomfortable. Go see art that you don't understand. You know, a lot of us self-select. We go to an art show, a visual art show, either because we already know we like the artist or because we like the message. Go into an artistic space and look at a piece of art that makes no sense to you and sit there and wrestle with it. Doesn't mean you're going to come out loving it. That's not the necessary outcome, right? Be challenged by it. In terms of bringing this to the workspace, what I really would push you to do is, in the workspace, use language that's not often found in the workspace. So we talked before about, maybe energy and spirituality are flaky type languages. Bring that to your workspace. Talk about friendship. That's a big thing in my work. I truly believe that if we utilize the language of friendship more widely in our workspaces, we would have far more successful, thriving, innovative cultures. We are afraid to use the language of friendship in corporate settings, and that's a mistake. Use the language of emotion. Use the language of feeling. Make yourself vulnerable. And of course, anytime you're vulnerable, there's a risk in that, especially in corporate settings, especially in settings that may be more exploitive than not. There's a risk in being vulnerable. But when you're successful, when you allow yourself to be vulnerable and you build this connection and you influence other people and you share a moment of silent wonder, great things come out of that. So it's worth the risk. It's a higher risk than exploring these feelings in arts venues. So I would tell you, start with the arts venues, low risk, right? Worst case scenario, you'll have a bad night, big deal. Move from there into bringing these tools into your workspace settings and see what happens.
Now, this seems like a good time just to remind our audience of something that you had written at the end of your piece for the conversation, which is that the AGO has been actively looking to be able to reduce barriers to be able to access art. And so you can actually get an annual pass now for $35, which gives you access to all of their special exhibits. I don't know if Andy Warhol is still on, but I know they just started up their Picasso's Blue Period. That exhibit, which I went to on Saturday, and is delightful, especially for the integration of science into the arts. They ended up having these full descriptions of how it is that you can end up uncovering the initial paintings that are behind some of Picasso's famous works from the Blue Period, which was very cool to be able to see. And that's not something I typically expect from my arts venues.
Wonderful.
Now, and also, as you were talking about choosing something that makes you feel uncomfortable, I was instantly reminded of when you took me to a Skinny Puppy show, and there was somebody who was, it looked like it was like, I can't even remember, he was in some kind of Chewbacca costume, and then there was fake blood going out into the crowd, and I am very clearly somebody who is much more comfortable at the AGO than I am at, what is Skinny Puppy considered?
Another wonderful Canadian band. So, we've really been celebrating Canadian talent today, which we need to. Yes. Yeah.
Now, if we've got a couple more questions. Next question is, any practical tips for managers to be able to co-create a space that can encourage innovation and creativity among their employees in the workplace?
Yeah, so I think, in my book, Connected Capitalism, there was a great tip I got from someone who's an expert in this piece of it. And he said there's a dual effort that has to happen. The first thing is to take an active interest in those who are on your team. So the first thing is to put out there and say, I want to create a space where we can be vulnerable. I want to create a space where we can be more creative and engaged in this co-creation. And he said, but what comes with opening that space is really then having little tolerance for those who are lazy, for those who are exploitive, and for those who don't meet the standards they set for themselves. So it's this two-part effort, right? Where you're being soft in one sense, because you're bringing your emotions, your openness, your feelings, your vulnerability to the environment. But that doesn't mean anything goes. It sort of relates to what we talked about earlier with Ronnie Burkett and safety. It's a similar idea, but even further, where he says your standards actually have to be more rigorous in this environment. You have to actually be more accountable in this environment, that give and take. And I like that, I like that because it speaks the language that is most, I'll say, comfortable for corporate people, whilst making them uncomfortable, right? So we're making them uncomfortable by bringing in the language of emotion and vulnerability, but we're reminding them that this isn't an anything goes situation, that this isn't a scenario where we don't recognize the pressures that most businesses face. And we're trying to find this sort of hybrid approach that will allow us to be rigorous, be accountable, but also co-create in the moment. The other thing I would suggest, and I encourage you to check out the book, Connected Capitalism, is to recognize that there's a three-part relationship here. The spiritual experience in the workforce, as I define it, is built on a pillar of meaning, connection, and wonder. And it is those three forces working together that really allow these innovative environments to happen. So in your workspace, make sure that there is meaning. In other words, make sure that there's a purpose that goes beyond simply making money. Through that purpose, look at the connections you're building, powerful, meaningful, real face-to-face human relationships with other stakeholders. From there, you get to wonder, your paradigm breaks, you innovate, you create something new. And then the process starts again. Because once our frames of reference have been broken, once our sense-making has been shattered by wonder, we now need a new search for meaning, which will lead us to new connections and new opportunities for wonder. So don't be shy about bringing in practical, like in real down-to-earth practical sense, bring that into your workspace. Look for those opportunities to go meaning, connection, wonder, start again in a practical, demanding, accountable environment.
Now, one last question for you. Are you optimistic about our post-COVID future?
It's an excellent question. And I think I'm optimistic that there is a great opportunity afoot. We are at a very unique point in history where change can happen. My fear is there's an equal opportunity for more exploitation and more regression. I think that if those of us who believe in the power of wonder and art assert ourselves, are proactive and reactive, we can really bring change. If we're not proactive, though, if we just let inertia take its course, those on the other side might grab their moment. So I'm optimistic about the possibility right now that might not have been presented 10 years ago, but I would add the caveat that we need to take this moment, we need to embrace it. And so really, if it's our wrap-up sentence, we need to build these partnerships. We need to make sure our arts venues are stronger out of the pandemic, not weaker. We need to make sure our artists are more empowered out of the pandemic, not less empowered. We need to make sure creative businesses are thriving, at least in the long term, by our support today, and that we don't let them disappear. So if we take the opportunity and we build wonder, and we build connections, and we support our creative spaces, and we demand vulnerability and accountability, maybe things will go in the right way.
Thank you so much for your time today. It's
Thanks,
been
Kelly. This was
wonderful
fun.
talking about this.
Thank you so much, Kelly and David. As someone who is new to this topic and this idea, that was just absolutely fascinating. David, thank you so much for spending this time with us and sharing your work. And thank you, Kelly, for joining us and moderating this discussion. I love this almost intimate feeling of listening to a conversation between colleagues and friends. So thank you so much for allowing us to share this with you. Today's session will be posted on our YouTube page at youtube.com/YorkU alumni for those of you who would like to rewatch it or perhaps watch some past sessions that you may have missed. Before we say goodbye to you and our audience, thank you all again for taking the time to join us today. I really hope you enjoyed listening to Kelly and David. We do have one last poll question for you. The question is, how would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following this discussion? So it should be there on your screen right now. And I'll just give everyone a moment to respond. Okay, thank you there for participating. Next month, we do have a full calendar of events lined up for you. On November 1st, we kick off the month with our YorkU Photo Challenge, which challenges you to take and submit photos of outdoor spaces from any of our campuses. So definitely check out our website for more information on that. On November 3rd, we have our next Scholars Hub with Ingrid Veninger, Associate Professor at the School of Arts, Media, Performance and Design, with the session titled Collaboration and the Art of Co-Creating Through Uncertainty. On November 4th, we launch a brand new series called Mid-Career Conversations, which are alumni-led conversations and networking sessions. The first one is about becoming an author, which sounds really, really interesting. And then on November 18th, we have the previously mentioned YorkU Alumni Awards Show. We hope to see some of you there for that. On November 24th, we have another Scholars Hub with Janet Moshe, Associate Professor at Osgood Hall Law School, and her session is titled Intimate Partner Violence and Access to Justice. On November 25th, we have our gratitude session, which is a networking event for young alumni. And finally, on November 27th, we have York Circle with a panel presentation titled Francophone in Canada, Negotiating Minority and Majority Rights. So a really packed schedule coming up for you. You may register for the next Scholars Hub or any of these events at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Thank you, everyone, and be well.